Welcome, everyone, to the Jewish Democratic Council of America's emergency briefing on the Supreme Court decision regarding presidential immunity. In the words of Justice Sonia Sotomayor, a president should not be king above the law. And to add our own words, especially not a 34-time convicted felon and twice impeached former president who is pledged to be a dictator on day one. Donald Trump already thinks he's king, and this decision, made by a conservative 6-justice majority on the Supreme Court, half of whom were appointed by Donald Trump, only reaffirms our greatest fears about Donald Trump's abuse of and ongoing plans to abuse power. This decision not only has implications for the 2024 election, but it will have lasting implications on our democracy, especially if Donald Trump wins in November. That is why we, as the voice and political home of Jewish voters, in support of policies and Democratic candidates who share our values, are doing everything we can to ensure Donald Trump is defeated in November. And we're grateful to the hundreds of you for joining us today to hear from the foremost expert on voting rights and leading defender of democracy, Marc Elias. Marc is the founding partner of the Elias Law Group. He's represented both the Democratic National Committee and Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee, and has served as general counselor for former Secretaries of State John Kerry and Hillary Clinton and Vice President Kamala Harris. In 2020, Marc led efforts to fight voter disenfranchisement cases in the lead up to the general election, and in its aftermath, stopped Donald Trump and his legal team's efforts to steal the election by winning a remarkable 64 out of 65 false Trump election lawsuits. And in 2021, Marc became the first recipient of JDCA's Ruth Bader Ginsburg Justice Award. And in honor of Justice Ginsburg, we'll start today by recognizing the phrase that hung in her chambers, Tzedek, Tzedek Tirdof, justice, justice, you shall pursue. That is why we are here, in pursuit of justice and in defense of our democracy. So Marc, thank you so much for being here. And let's dive in. After this week's Supreme Court ruling, you wrote that you fear it has changed the course of American history in a dark and dangerous direction. Please elaborate for us. How has this decision endangered our democracy and changed the course of American history?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me. I am always happy to talk to groups of Jewish voters and Democrats. So there's no group I like talking to more and find more rewarding than talking to Jewish Democrats, and the tremendous work, Halie, that you and the entire team do to both promote Democratic candidates, but also through the lens of Jewish values and Jewish history. And I think that in order to understand the recent Supreme Court decision that ruled in favor of Donald Trump on the claim of immunity, you need to view it through two lenses. The first is the lens of the law. What did it actually do to the law? And so what it did is it basically said presidents are immune from criminal prosecution for virtually all of their official acts. There's a little bit of fine print about what's on the outer perimeter and what's not on the outer perimeter. But I think, in very sort of common sense terms, what it basically means is that a president of the United States can, in fact, assassinate their political opponent, poison their Secretary of State, off their Attorney General, and they can't face criminal prosecution. So, at its sort of broadest legal or its most direct legal consequence, what it does is it confers immunity on presidents. Obviously, for Donald Trump, what that means is that it puts a significant roadblock in the way of a number of the cases for which he has already been indicted, but it will have those consequences in the future. But I think that only tells half the story. And I am reminded of after the Supreme Court's decision in Citizens United, and people were trying to digest what did it mean, and a lot of lawyers were giving what was actually quite a correct legal answer, which is that corporations can now make independent expenditures. Okay, that's the technical holding of Citizens United. But what it actually did, and I gave interviews at the time that said this, what it actually did was signaled a culture shift for how not just corporations, not just donors, but literally the entire political system would view money in politics. It transformed the way in which we view the role that big money plays in politics. And whether that's good or bad, it doesn't really matter. It just altered that dynamic. And my fear for democracy is that that is what we have here. We have the Supreme Court of the United States making up out of whole cloth, right? The Constitution contains a legislative immunity for members of Congress called speech and debate immunity. It is silent as the executive branch, but here it is, the Supreme Court created a immunity out of whole cloth that I fear will transform the willingness of authoritarian leaders like Donald Trump. And not just him, but his followers. If you look at some of the other court decisions like the Fisher case that narrowed the prosecution grounds for January 6th defendants, what it is the Supreme Court is saying that just as in Citizens United that they're open for business for big money, the Supreme Court here is saying that if you are an authoritarian leader who wants to abuse power in the office of the presidency, if you are supporters of them, if you are the people behind Project 2025, go big. Don't worry. We got your back. And I think that is going to have all kinds of consequences for the office of the presidency of the United States. It raises the stakes for who holds that office, because it is no longer true that no man is above the law. Donald Trump, if he retakes the office, will be an authoritarian, and he will view himself as above the law.
So you have, both just now, but also in writing, given a warning about Donald Trump, saying this decision gave him a roadmap for dictatorship and retribution if he's elected. How exactly could it solidify his plans outlined already in what they've put out, to be a dictator on day one and to seek political retribution against his political opponents? And the final question there is also, what guardrails are left on the power of the executive?
Yeah, so look, again, I think you have to look at not just the one immunity decision, but I think you need to look at a sort of a series of decisions. So let's start with a few months ago, the Supreme Court said that the state of Colorado could not have him kicked off the ballot for being an insurrectionist. Okay, that sent a message that, in fact, not just Donald Trump can't be kicked off the ballot for being an insurrectionist, but no Republican member of Congress, no Republican candidate can be kicked off the ballot by a state court. Okay, so that opened the aperture of who can now serve in government that was a participant in January 6th. Not just Donald Trump, but the Trump movement. The next case you have to look at, as I mentioned, is the Fisher case. This is a case very technical in some respects, but it dealt with whether the Department of Justice could use a tool that it had used against a large number of January 6 defendants to charge them for the crime of obstructing an official proceeding. And the Supreme Court narrowed the plain text of that statute to say it did not apply unless there are documents or records involved. So beating up a police officer, spraying bear spray at a police officer, knocking down barricades, breaking windows, not enough, only if it involves records. So what message does that send to Donald Trump? Well, it says, and you've already heard him say this, that he's been calling these insurrectionists hostages. So what does this do? This gives him rhetorical force to his supporters that he told them that this was the deep state. He told them this was weaponization of the Department of Justice. He told them that these January 6 defendants had done nothing wrong. And now here is the Supreme Court, at least for a subset of them, agreeing that some of the charges need to be reevaluated or dismissed. Then finally, or not finally, then you had the Loper decision, which cuts back on the ability of agencies to fill in gaps in the law using their expertise and judgment. You know, this was a 40-year doctrine that basically said if you have laws that are that have not anticipated all circumstances, we are going to let the experts at federal agencies, in consultation with the public, in consultation with trade associations, interested parties, advocacy groups, we're going to let them interpret these statutes, and we're going to, in the first instance, defer to that agency interpretation. Why is that so important? It's important because it recognizes that we should have government on the merits, that we should have people who are expert in laws, experts in policies, making decisions. Well, expertise in government is the opposite of what Donald Trump wants. He wants cronyism in government. He wants the ability to replace the civil service with his political appointees, and he wants the ability to rule, as you say, as a dictator for at least one day. By the way, no dictator is satisfied with being a dictator for one day. It's like the old story when you were a kid and, you were asked, if you were asked what 3 wishes do you want, your first wish was to have 5 more wishes, right? So having a dictator for a day just means that you'll have a dictator. And then finally, you have the immunity decision, which says that basically if he is reelected, any action he takes, including the take care clause, which is to take care the laws are faithfully executed, is immune from criminal prosecution. Well, we know Mitch McConnell is not going to ever agree to allow his caucus to vote for a conviction, or his replacement won't. You know that Mike Johnson, who is the single most responsible federal elected official other than Donald Trump for the insurrection on January 6th, he's never going to let his conference support even an impeachment. And so even if Democrats have control of the House and have control of the Senate, God willing, you won't be able to push through Congress any accountability against Donald Trump if he's president, because they weren't able to last time. And now there's no criminal sanctions holding over his head. So what the roadmap that the Supreme Court drew is basically quite simple. Your supporters can go further than they've ever gone before, and they won't be criminally prosecuted. You can go as far as you want, and you won't be criminally prosecuted. Oh, and by the way, you have the pardon power in case one of your supporters steps over the line. And so it creates this kind of imperial presidency in which he has already said he is going to target his political opponents and seek retribution. We need to start listening to him and take him both literally and seriously. Because when he says he's going to seek retribution, that is what he's going to do. Now, you ask, what accountability is and what can we do? So I am reminded of King Solomon in Kohelet saying that if you see oppression of the poor, this is chapter 5, verse 7, if you see oppression of the poor and deprivation of justice and righteousness in the province, wonder not about the matter, for the highest over the high waits, and there are higher ones over them. So I oftentimes think about this passage because if what I take away from it is that if you are wronged, if there is injustice, go to court. And if you don't get remedy in court, there are higher above them. There's the Supreme Court. But in our constitutional system, the highest above all of them, the highest of the high, are the people. Right? So we are the people who can be the highest of the high. And what we need to do is to vote in December. I'm sorry, we need to vote in November. We need to vote in November like the future of democracy is on the ballot, because it is. We need to make sure we are all registered. We need to make sure our friends and our families are registered. And we need to not cut away the cobwebs and the nonsense and all of the other things that may be cluttering people's brains. And we need to tell them to vote for a Democrat from top of the ballot to the very, very bottom. I don't want to hear about it. I don't want to hear anything else about why this candidate or that candidate or this moderate Republican or that sensible centrist. You need to vote for democracy. And that means voting from top of the ticket to the bottom, Democratic. And that's why I love the work that Jewish Democrats do.
Thank you, Marc. You mentioned this decision may have an impact on some of Trump's ongoing criminal cases. And the sentencing of the hush money case in New York was now delayed by more than 2 months to mid-September. Trump's lawyers are now making the case that conviction must be thrown out in light of the Supreme Court decision. And Trump announced that this decision exonerated him. Did it?
You see, Haley, I think that question is so brilliant because it actually ties together the two lessons that I think we need to learn from this. The first, what does it mean for the four cases? So obviously the DC case, the one that was actually up on appeal, it means that that now needs to go back to the trial court for further hearings. And I'm not optimistic that what's going to come out of that is going to be a recognizable criminal case like anything we saw going in, right? Already the Supreme Court has said the portions of the indictment that deal with conversations with the Department of Justice have to be dismissed. But the conversation with the vice president, needs to be subject to a test. But when you actually dig into what the Supreme Court said, it's going to be very difficult for Jack Smith or any prosecutor to say that much of that case survives because you're not allowed to inquire into Donald Trump's motive, according to the Supreme Court, and you can't use evidence of official acts even to prove other portions that are not official. So let's just say the DC case, at a minimum, has been hollowed out, if not entirely gutted, and it is also on hold for a very long time because all of those hearings are going to take time. The Georgia case, same problem, same prospect, same everything. The New York case is the one that you would think would be the most immune from this decision, but Donald Trump his lawyers have already sought to say we need a hearing here, and the judge has postponed sentencing if there needs to be sentencing, the judge said, until September. So that is sort of the opening gambit there in September. You would think that case would not be affected by this ruling because, after all, the acts that he took with Stormy Daniels were not official acts, and they also took place before he was president. But his legal team is going to ride this horse as far as they can, and see if they can catch a break. And at a minimum, they're going to create a cloud over whether that conviction holds. And then Florida. Let's be honest, the Florida case is like something out of a Dickens novel. I mean, if you have not read Bleak House, then you are not prepared for what's been going on in Florida. That case has been on a fast track to nowhere for a very long time. They are still sort of arguing in circles about what should be very, very simple principles, in my view. But I suspect that the Trump world will raise this precedent in that courtroom as well. And I expect, given the judge's track record there, it'll get an ample hearing and rehearing and a lot of consideration. So that case is, who knows? That case is moving very, very slow. But Haley, I want to point to the second part of the implication of your question, which is, setting aside what happens technically to these cases, is it vindication? So, on one hand, we can say, no, it's not vindication. Like, he's still engaged in the conduct he engaged in, and that is not vindication. That is not exoneration. That is immunity at most, right? Which is different than saying you didn't do it. It says you may have done it, but you are immune from having done it. But in the court of public opinion, and most importantly, in the part of public opinion that motivates Donald Trump's base, it is vindication. It is exoneration. It is the first step towards retribution, right? In Donald Trump's supporters' world, in the MAGA mindset, in the Project 2025 roadmap, this is just evidence that Donald Trump was wrong. Not only should he not stand trial, he was wrong. And the Supreme Court has proven that everything he said was correct about how he was a victim of these out of control special counsel and a left-wing conspiracy, or all the other nonsense that they spread. So this is going to energize his base. It is also going to cause him and them to be more reckless. If you thought we saw a reckless Donald Trump before, just wait to see what happens if Donald Trump gets in office again in 2025.
Okay, well, I am now incorporating some of the audience questions, so feel free to continue to post them in the chat. We are going through them. We've gotten a few along these lines, so I'm going to ask the first one here. What stops President Biden from exercising the powers provided by this Supreme Court decision to preserve democracy? With no check on the executive at this point, what would stop him from taking even broader action than he has taken to defend democracy and voting rights?
So this is the shameful thing about the modern Republican Party. I wrote a piece for Democracy Docket, which is a news outlet online. I hope everyone goes and subscribes. It's free. But I wrote a piece about the asymmetry of election denialism a few weeks ago. And that asymmetry doesn't just exist in election denialism. The theory I laid out there is that Republicans' willingness to flout the law and norms in suppressing the vote is not matched by Democrats because we believe in protecting the vote. Right. So there's an asymmetry in their election denialism. But that asymmetry is not just in election or voting laws. They're also in the acts of elected officials. Joe Biden won't engage in abuse of office because Joe Biden is a decent person. Because Joe Biden took an oath to office to uphold the Constitution that he respects and he honors and he cherishes and he follows. For Donald Trump, the idea that the oath of office to uphold the Constitution would apply is, to paraphrase from a different area, is for suckers and losers, right? He views it as something that he shows strength by flouting. Joe Biden shows fealty to his oath of office. He shows reverence to the U.S. Constitution. He takes seriously the office that he holds, and he pays it respects. And upholds it and honors the dignity of it. And so you cannot expect that President Biden, or for that matter, Democrats in the House and the Senate or governors or whoever else, that they are going to engage in the kind of flouting of their oaths of office and the U.S. Constitution in the way in which Donald Trump not just does, but which he inspires others to do and which he celebrates and reveres. And so that is the terrible asymmetry that we're in our democracy. It doesn't mean that Democrats shouldn't show up to a gunfight with guns. Like, I am not a, turn the other cheek kind of guy. But it does mean that we, whether it's the lawyers, we play by the rules while Rudy Giuliani spouts nonsense. Joe Biden plays by the rules while Donald Trump says he wants to be a dictator by a day. So we need to fight hard for democracy, and I can promise everyone we do. But there's never going to be an equality to how the two sides are going to respect the rule of law.
Okay, this question, I guess, picks up on the gunfight with guns, or showing up with the guns, without specifically addressing the issue of guns. The winner of the 2024 election will likely nominate at least 2 and as many as 4 justices to the Supreme Court. How could those appointments change the makeup and in turn the decisions of the court? Could this decision be overturned? And do you support expanding the court beyond 9 justices?
Yeah, so I someone asked me this the other day. They said, does this mean this is forever? And I said, so here's the good news and the bad news. Nothing with the Supreme Court is forever, right? We all learned that Roe versus Wade, which conservative justice after conservative justice, all of them sat in a chair in the U.S. Senate hearing room, and in one form or another called it precedent upon precedent, super precedent, settled law, like whatever terminology they used. And then when given an opportunity, they overturned Roe versus Wade and Dobbs. So they paid no respect to the fact that it was settled law or precedent or super precedent or precedent upon precedent. Likewise, the case I mentioned involving deference to agency action. This was a unanimous decision of the Supreme Court in the 1980s when it came down. That was 40 years ago, and it just got thrown out 6-3, notwithstanding the fact that it has been relied on. It become a bedrock of the way in which government agencies operate. So don't ever think that anything is forever. And if there's one thing that history teaches all of us, and certainly as Jewish Democrats, we know, anytime you think it can't get worse, it can get worse. But it also can get better, right? It can also get better. And so, yes, the next president of the United States or President Biden in the next 4 years of his term will have the opportunity to potentially reshape the court yet again. And that can either get shaped much to the bad if it's Donald Trump, or it can get better. And if it gets to the better, just imagine what that world looks like. We could see an expansion of democracy. We could see an expansion of voting rights, an expansion of civil rights, a reversal of authoritarianism in this country, and a recommitment to constitutionalism that views at its core the dignity of human rights and the importance of the Constitution, not just as a piece of paper, but as a document that affirms our commitment to the peaceful transfer of power and to democracy. So don't give up. This is why I said, like, everyone's got to vote. Like, everyone, whenever I read, people who say, well, I'm really upset with President Biden about this or that, so I'm not going to vote, or I'm not going to vote for Democrats. I want to just jump off a bridge because the future of our democracy has not yet been written. And who is on the court will play a big role in what is written when we get there. In terms of court reform, yeah, I'm in favor of it. Like, I think we need to have a wide-ranging discussion about court reform, not just the number of justices, but the kind of cases they hear. They choose their own cases. The shame of this, Halie, is that they chose to take that immunity case. They didn't have to. They could have left the lower court case in place. They chose to take the Colorado case. They didn't have to. They chose to take that case. They chose to take Dobbs. They didn't have to. Right. So, we should have a discussion about why is this court only hearing 60 cases a year, and why is it choosing the cases it are? So it is. I think we need to have a real reevaluation of how the Supreme Court operates, from ethics to composition, from case selection to jurisdiction. I think that needs to be a national discussion. I think it should be front and center in the presidential elections and Senate and House elections. And I would hope that when Democrats keep the White House and have control of both the House and the Senate in 2025, I hope we have that discussion.
In her dissent, Justice Sotomayor concluded by noting her fear for the future of our democracy. What are you most fearful of when it comes to the future of our democracy?
So look, I am fearful that people think that democracy is a permanent state of affairs. People think that, all of the horrors of the past are in the past. All of the worst forms of government that we saw oppress people are in the past. That's ancient history, or it's history, but that there is a steady march. One of the phrases that I have never ascribed to, and I recognize that many people on this call do, is the notion that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. I'm not so sure it necessarily bends towards justice. It only bends towards justice if people are pushing on it to bend towards justice. I don't think it's inevitably that we are headed in the right direction. So the thing that I worry about between now and November is complacency, is that people think, we survived 4 years with Donald Trump, it won't be worse. It'll be worse. I want to send a message. Well, you know what? I worked on I saw Al Gore and John Kerry and Hillary Clinton when people thought they were just sending harmless messages, right? We need to treat seriously what it means to be a citizen and to vote in this country. So I worry about that between now and then. In the long run, what I worry about is that we are watching the Republican Party destroy norms in this country. There was a time not that long ago when someone like Donald Trump would have been just an anathema to either political party, when the idea of running a candidate who had incited an insurrection in the nation's capital would have been disqualifying and more, when being a convicted felon would have been disqualifying. And instead, we have watched the once grand old party of Lincoln turn into a movement that borders that is Christian nationalist in its core and borders at times, frankly, on neo-fascism. And I say that not lightly. I recognize what these words mean. And it is, you have to be careful with your rhetoric. But, when you look at someone who says he wants to weaponize the Department of Justice, he wants to control who gets prosecuted, he wants to prosecute his political opponents in military tribunals. You may think that that's rhetoric, but when Donald Trump says he wants to prosecute his political opponents in military tribunals, you should take him literally and seriously. The Supreme Court is telling him he has the power to basically do what he wants. So I worry about complacency leading to a new form of authoritarianism, and recovering from that new form of authoritarianism will be not the work of a few years. It'll be a generational struggle. And again, there is no certainty that in the end, it all works out for the best.
A televised military tribunal. I think he
Correct.
specified how he would like to see Liz Cheney face televised military tribunal. Um, you are absolutely right that Trump and his allies have been very clear about what they intend to do. They even have a plan for their transition, Project 2025, hundreds of pages online for us all to see. Um, to what degree do you see a relationship between Project 2025 and what they've outlined their plans, Trump's plans for political retribution if he wins, and the majority decision in this case?
Oh my God, they're intertwined. I mean, these opinions are the accelerant for Project 2025. Project 2025 is fundamentally about making a Trump administration in 2025 more efficient and being authoritarian. I think a lot of conservatives looked at the first Trump administration and thought, how much more ruthless and effective they could have been if they'd been more organized. And Project 2025 is basically an effort to bring organizational skill and ideological framework to what is basically an authoritarian movement. And so in order to achieve that, in order for Project 2025 to succeed, it needs two things. Number one, it needs Donald Trump to have a legal framework in which to be an authoritarian. And it needs a willingness for a large number of his adherents and followers to take action that would otherwise expose them to legal jeopardy and moral condemnation, right? So basically, it needs Donald Trump to be an effective strongman, and it needs a lot of his supporters to be foot soldiers in him being a strongman. Well, what did the Supreme Court do? Well, on the first order, it conferred immunity upon him, and it stripped from executive agencies a lot of their power. Okay, so check and check, right? Undoing the administrative state, as they would say, is one of their goals, and the Loper case went a long way towards that. Creating a unitary executive where the president can do whatever he wants. Supreme Court went a long way towards doing that, right? So that's kind of column A. Column B, though, is which I keep talking about because I think it again can't be overlooked. Is how does Donald Trump get a lot of people to follow his lead? People talk about the guardrails in the first Trump administration, whether it was Don McGahn or it was the other White House counsels or it was people in the Department of Justice who basically held Donald Trump back from his worst impulses, right? What that meant was that he couldn't effectuate the worst of the worst because there were people around him who wouldn't let him. Well, what does the Supreme Court do when it essentially immunizes both the president, but also indicates that it is going to cut back on DOJ's ability to prosecute people who were involved in January 6th? Well, it sends a subtle but loud message to them. Listen to Donald Trump. You can go as far as he wants. You can maybe even to go even further than he wants, and it's going to be okay. You're going to be protected. And so Project 2025 sort of puts a patina of respectability on it. The Supreme Court puts a patina of respectability and lawfulness behind it. And that is why it is so dangerous.
We're getting some questions about, you had mentioned Christian nationalism and its ties to Trump and Project 2025. We're getting some questions about that. If you could elaborate about the ties between the MAGA movement, Donald Trump, Project 2025, and right-wing extremists, including Christian nationalists.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that one of the things about the people who are now around Donald Trump and who are promoting his agenda and who are urging him to go further is I'm not sure that they would recoil from the term Christian nationalists. I mean, I think that they fundamentally embrace a view of American society in which a particular form of Christianity is fused with their view of national identity. And it's very, very scary, but it's not actually, Ellie, that's surprising. I mean, it is not the first authoritarian regime to fuse those two things together, and it doesn't usually work out well for people who are not themselves Christian nationalists. But if you look at their frankly unhinged view of abortion, of the abortion debate, I mean, look at what the state of Idaho. We talk about the Idaho decision that the Supreme Court heard about whether or not they have to render life-saving care to women who may, are in serious medical distress, whether they can render care if that includes abortion. I mean, that is not even sort of in the ambit of where the pre-Dobbs discussion was, even among most of the people who count themselves as pro-life. But it represents a kind of fury towards women's rights that and a role for women in society that is only almost unrecognizable. The decision of the state of Louisiana, who, by the way, has all kinds of problems that their citizens need addressed, including, education and poverty and voting rights and the like. The fact that they have passed a law to put a particular form of the Ten Commandments in classrooms is unmistakable. I say a particular form of Ten Commandments because, Halie, as you know, the version of the Ten Commandments that they are putting in the classroom are not the version of the Ten Commandments that Jews would find in a synagogue or in their prayer books, right? It's a different version of the Ten Commandments. So it is a Christian version, it is a particular denominational version of the Ten Commandments. So the fusing of religion and a form of Christianity with their national identity is core to, I think, what they're trying to do. And as you pointed out, it then merges quite closely with far right-wing elements of in this country, who Donald Trump has been embracing for years. He told the Proud Boys to stand by and stand back. He didn't condemn them. He remember back in 2016, he had a hard time condemning David Duke, former Klansman of sorts. He called the people at Charlottesville, he said there were good people on both sides. This is a movement that genuinely believes those things. And so it is very dangerous for democracy. It is very dangerous for Democrats. It's very dangerous for Jewish people and other religious and ethnic minorities. But they are quite clear that they are merging those things. This is not a dog whistle. This is like a bullhorn. This is quite loud.
We have quite a few questions about, and I know we've already explored this somewhat, but it's worth repeating. What can be done to change this decision? We have someone ask, can a bill be passed by the Senate? Someone else has asked about a constitutional amendment. I know you emphasized, and we are continuing to emphasize, the importance of voting. And some in the chat have even, I think, kind of underestimated the impact that this election will have on decisions like this. But how can we check this decision? How can we roll it back in some way?
Right. So look, you can always amend the Constitution, but that is not easy. We have not in our country's history been able to amend our Constitution, except in sort of very rare circumstances. But that's an option. I think that the Supreme Court, the current composition of the Supreme Court, would say that Congress can't do it by law if what they're trying to do is roll back the immunity decision, because they would say that's a matter of constitutional law. Obviously, as you've already asked, the next, over the course of the next presidential term, we may see new opportunities to appoint justices to the Supreme Court. We may see court reform and change the composition of the court that way. And I think all those things need to be on the table. So those are ways to do it. But I want to take issue with the premise of the question, Halie, and I know you will, I think, agree with me on this, that it is easy to throw your hands up in the air and say we need to do something big. We need to amend the Constitution. Congress needs to pass a law. It is harder for us to all look within ourselves and say, what are the small things we can do? What is the thing I can do? And there are things that everyone on this call can do. I've told this story in other settings with Jewish Democrats. But when I was studying for my bar mitzvah, there was a guy who was in his 50s, was obviously a long time ago. This was in the early 1980s, and he had been a prisoner of war in World War II. He was a Jewish soldier from New York who had been captured by the Nazis. So just like imagine that for a moment. You are a Jewish soldier from New York City who has literally been captured by the Nazis, and you were in a stalag. And he and his fellow Jewish soldiers who were prisoners of war, were put to work in doing various work detail projects, and they wanted to do something. And so what they did is they got little pieces of metal shards from the surrounding barbed wire. And as they would process, they were on an agricultural camp of some sort. And when they get the produce, like potatoes, they would poke holes in them so that they would rot. And he told this story, I remember vividly. He said, our goal was that if we poked holes in enough produce, enough potatoes, we would rot the food, and then the German army that was getting the food would starve. So just imagine you are a prisoner of war, you are Jewish, you are held by the Nazis in World War II, in a prisoner of war work camp, and you are taking pieces of barbed wire, you are poking them against your bare skin till they're bloody, your fingers are bloody, with the off hope that the result of this will be to starve the Nazi war effort and win. So look, every one of us can be poking holes in the potatoes. Every one of us can be doing the thing in our lives that makes it harder for Donald Trump to be elected and to become a dictator. For some of them, for me, I litigate in court every day, and I fight hard every single day. I don't compromise, I don't yield. I am fighting for democracy. I am doing the thing I can do every day. But every one of us can do that thing. For some of you, it is contacting your friends, your families, your neighbors, your clients, your customers, and telling them it is not okay what Donald Trump and the Republicans are trying to do. It is not okay. For some of you, it is posting social media or writing postcards to people, telling them to remember to vote or check their voter registration. Some of you may be able to become volunteers for campaigns or be able to work the polls. But one way or another, each of us has to do everything we can, rather than think there's going to be this single moonshot solution that Congress is going to do or the president's going to do. Yeah, we have to give them the tools to do it. We have to give them the tools we have to give Joe Biden re-election and the tools of a Democratic Senate and a Democratic House so that they can do those things. But we can't look past the things we can all do in our lives. And that includes standing up proudly in the town square and saying, I am not going to participate and allow this country to turn into an authoritarian dictatorship but without speaking out against it. And I'm going to volunteer in civic organizations or in political organizations to fight against it. So I realize, Halie, that's not pass this amendment to the Constitution, but those things are possible, but that's not an excuse for us to not all act on our own in the meantime.
Right. Well, this election's in 124 days, and we all have the ability to influence the outcome of this election in a short period of time. Our final question is, what gives you hope? Because obviously these have been a dark few days and people are looking for light. So if we could end by shedding some light for all of us and telling us what gives you hope.
Look, what gives me hope is, first of all, organizations like Jewish Democrats, right? You all wake up every day, whether it's been a good day or a bad day, whether it is a day after a primary has been won or a general election has been won, or it is a day after heartbreaking losses, whether it is October 7th or just another day in the calendar. You guys wake up and you fight hard for democracy in America. And so that, when I see that resolved by organizations like Jewish Democrats and other organizations of Democrats, it gives me hope. But the other thing that gives me hope is that if I give up hope, then the other side wins, right? The cynics want us to not be hopeful. Donald Trump traffics in despair, right? Think about his inaugural address. The title of it was American Carnage, right? He wants us to give up hope. And I'm not willing to give that to him. I am not willing to give Donald Trump hopelessness from me. So, right now, my law firm, my legal team is in court in 50 cases around the country, fighting for the right to vote. And we are winning. We're not winning every case, but we're winning more than we're losing. The Republican effort to destroy our free and fair elections is failing. They're trying, they're litigating a lot too, but they're failing, and we're winning. And so what gives me hope is that even on the worst days of the worst court decisions, I can turn around and say, you know what? In New York, the ban on handing out food and water to people waiting in line got struck down by a court, and that means that voters in New York will now not have to stand in lines without that. When I look in Nevada and I look at the efforts by Republicans to strike down or limit mail-in voting is failing. When I look in Arizona and I see that their efforts to try to undo fair election procedures in Arizona is failing, that gives me hope. When I see that in Alabama and in Louisiana, for the first time in years and in decades, Black voters will have a second Black opportunity district in both of those states for congressional elections. And my legal team played a critical role in both of those wins. That gives me hope. So it's not all bad. What's happening in the courts of the Supreme Court is not great. It's terrible in many respects. But I look around and I see that we are making a difference into voters around the country, in courthouses around the states, in all 50 states. There are 150 cases right now pending in 38 states. And those cases are going to set the ground rules for how we vote this November and whether we have a free and fair election. So I'm very hopeful about that. I'm not immune to the challenges. I see the Republicans are trying to make it harder to vote and easier to cheat every day. And Donald Trump is, garnering their support. But I am hopeful that if we all pull together, we all do our part, we will succeed this November, and we will save democracy for at least another few years.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. I think we're winning because there's right and wrong. And to quote Adam Schiff, right still matters. We're also winning because you, Mark, are representing Democrats and defending democracy each day. And we're grateful. We're grateful. I want to thank the hundreds of you who have joined us today and many others via C-SPAN. And I'm going to turn things over to our Chief Program Officer, Bobby Saferstein, to tell us all what we can do in the next 124 days to impact the outcome of this election and to defend our democracy, ensuring that we do not end up with a dictatorship. So over to you, Bobby.
Thank you, Haley, and thank you to Mark and each of you for joining us today. On the final day of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, Benjamin Franklin was asked, "What have we got, a republic or a monarchy?" "A republic," Dr. Franklin answered, "if you can keep it." As we've seen play out over the past several weeks, it's going to be up to each of us to defend democracy in this election, and we have a plan to do so. This election is a binary choice between democracy and dictatorship, as Haley wrote today in Haaretz. We must do everything we can to elect Democrats who share our values, and we must vote. To learn more about how you can get involved with JDCA, please visit jewishdems.org, where you can sign up for our events, learn more about all of the benefits of our membership program, and how you can join one of our state and local chapters. Throughout the summer, JDCA is hosting phone banks to recruit volunteers and turn out the Jewish vote where it counts. To sign up for all of our events, including phone banks in Arizona, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Florida, please click on the link in the chat. And if you've never phone banked before, next Friday, July 12th at noon Eastern Time, we are hosting a national volunteer training, which is a great way to learn how you can help JDCA mobilize the Jewish vote this cycle. And if you're interested in becoming involved with one of our state and local chapters and affiliates, we encourage you to fill out this interest form, also in the chat. As we close out the week early and celebrate our country's founding, we just want to take a moment to thank each of you for being a part of JDCA and for everything you are doing to safeguard our democracy today and in the weeks and months ahead. May the remaining hostages in Gaza be released, and may this war that has claimed so many and so much soon end. Wishing everyone a happy and hopeful 4th of July and an early Shabbat Shalom. See you soon. Goodbye.